Pulmonary embolism. Is that what you think it is? The millionaire's voice dripped disdain, like some kid in a hoodie could diagnose what his private doctors missed. He wouldn't let this boy near his wife again. Catherine gasped, struggling for air, her eyes wild with terror. Elijah knew he had seconds. See, what they didn't know, these fancy first-class folks, was that Elijah wasn't guessing. He'd fought this monster before, watched it steal his own mother's breath. A life for a life? Maybe. But he also saw the fear in the millionaire's eyes. This wasn't about saving a life. It was about a chance, a secret hope. And he had no idea how Elijah's quiet kindness would change everything. She can't breathe. Someone help her, please. The desperate cry cut through the drone of the engines, slicing the cabin's dim tranquility like a knife. The flight attendants rushed forward, their faces masks of professional concern, barely concealing rising panic. A silver-haired man in an immaculate suit hovered over an elegant woman whose swollen belly betrayed her latest stage pregnancy. Her lips had taken on an alarming bluish tint. "I'm a wealth manager, not a doctor," the businessman shouted at a flight attendant who was fumbling with an emergency kit. "There must be a medical professional on this flight." His voice cracked with fear as he clutched his wife's hand. Their fingers intertwined, hers pale and limp, his trembling and adorned with a wedding band that caught the cabin lights in rhythmic flashes as he shook. Elijah watched, his 17-year-old frame tense with indecision. The cabin crew was asking for a doctor, scanning the first-class cabin with desperate eyes that skipped right over his row in economy. He knew why. Who would expect a black teenager in worn jeans and a faded hoodie to have any answers? But Elijah knew exactly what was happening to the pregnant woman. He'd seen it before. What happened in the next 30 minutes would forever alter the lives of everyone involved, especially the millionaire, who would later confess that he'd been prepared to offer anything to save his wife and unborn child. What he wasn't prepared for was what the boy would eventually ask for in return, a request so unexpected and profound that it would bring him to his knees in tears, forcing him to confront prejudices buried so deep he'd never acknowledge their existence. This is their story. If you're enjoying this journey, make sure to subscribe so you never miss our powerful true stories of unexpected connections that change lives forever. 8 hours earlier, Richard Harrington stepped out of the gleaming black Bentley onto the rain-slicked pavement outside JFK's International Terminal. His Italian leather shoes worth more than what many people earned in a week. At 58, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had built an empire from nothing, a man who expected doors to open when he approached them, and they always did. Today, however, all his wealth and influence felt hollow as he gently guided his wife, Catherine, from the car. "Easy now, sweetheart," he murmured, his arm protectively around her waist. At 43, Catherine Harrington was still breathtaking, her pregnancy giving her an ethereal glow that softened her normally sharp features. Her shoulder-length blonde hair framed a face that had graced charity gala photos in the society pages for years. But today, worry lines creased her forehead. "I'm fine, Richard," she insisted, though her hand rested protectively over her rounded belly. "Dr. Winters said it's perfectly safe to fly in the second trimester. The conference in London is important, and I want to be there when you receive your award." Richard nodded, but his eyes betrayed his concern. After 3 miscarriages and years of fertility treatments, this pregnancy was nothing short of miraculous. At 28 weeks, they were finally allowing themselves to hope. "First class all the way, private car waiting in London, and we'll have the doctor on call," Richard recited, as much to reassure himself as his wife. "I've arranged for the flight attendants to know about your condition." Catherine rolled her eyes affectionately. "You've thought of everything as always. That's why they're giving you that humanitarian financier of the year award, isn't it?" As their driver unloaded their matching set of Toomey luggage, neither noticed the yellow taxi that pulled up several cars behind them, or the lanky teenage boy who stepped out, shouldering a battered backpack and counting loose bills to pay the fare. Elijah Williams winced as he handed over nearly all his remaining cash to the taxi driver. The trip from his grandmother's apartment in Harlem to the airport had cost more than he'd anticipated. He tucked the remaining $20 bill into his worn wallet, emergency money his grandmother had insisted he take. "You're going to knock their socks off, baby," she had told him that morning, her gnarled hands straightening his collar with trembling fingers. At 73, Beatrice Williams was still the strongest person Elijah knew, despite the oxygen tube that now accompanied her everywhere and the medications that ate up most of her fixed income. "Those doctors at that fancy program in London going to see what I always seen in you." Elijah had simply nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. What he hadn't told his grandmother was that the Young Medical Achievers International Program had only provided a partial scholarship. The remainder, airfare, accommodations, meals had come from years of saved birthday money, part-time jobs, and the small life insurance policy his mother had left when she'd passed from breast cancer 3 years earlier. This trip represented everything: his future, his dreams, his chance to eventually lift his grandmother out of their one-bedroom apartment with the unreliable heating, and the landlord who never fixed the elevator that his grandmother could no longer navigate. As he entered the bustling terminal, Elijah pulled out the printed boarding pass and checked the departure gate. His heart raced with equal parts excitement and terror. He had never flown before, had never even left New York. Yet in a few hours, he would be crossing the Atlantic to a medical program that accepted only 50 students worldwide. The letter of recommendation from his AP biology teacher had called him a once-in-a-generation talent with an intuitive understanding of human physiology that cannot be taught. What his teacher didn't mention was how that understanding had been forged in necessity. As Elijah had become his grandmother's primary caregiver, learning to monitor her COPD, recognize the early signs of her congestive heart failure episodes, and administer her complex medication regimen. By 16, he could take vital signs as skillfully as many nursing students and had memorized the contraindications of every medication in their small bathroom cabinet. Navigating through the crowded terminal, Elijah couldn't help noticing how people subtly shifted away as he approached, how security guards tracked him with their eyes, how mothers pulled their children slightly closer. He'd grown accustomed to it, this unconscious choreography of bias. But today it stung more than usual. Today was supposed to be about possibility, about being seen for his mind rather than his appearance. He was so lost in thought that he nearly collided with a luggage cart being pushed by a harried-looking airline employee. As he sidestepped, he caught sight of the couple he'd seen outside, the man in the expensive suit now guiding his pregnant wife toward the first-class check-in counter, the airline staff jumping to attention at their approach. Elijah watched for a moment before turning toward the much longer economy line, unaware that their paths would cross again in the most dramatic of circumstances. As they settled into the premium lounge, Richard Harrington scrolled through emails on his phone while Catherine leafed through a pregnancy magazine. The soft leather chairs and muted lighting created a cocoon of privilege, separating them from the bustle of the main terminal. "Braxton Hicks again," Catherine murmured, shifting uncomfortably and pressing a hand to her side. "They've been more frequent lately." Richard looked up immediately. "Should we call Dr. Winters?" Catherine smiled reassuringly. "It's perfectly normal, Richard. Remember what the birthing class instructor said. My body's just practicing." Nodding reluctantly, Richard returned to his emails, but his attention was divided. The Harrington Financial Group was finalizing their largest philanthropic initiative to date, a medical center in Rwanda that would serve thousands of underserved patients. It was this project that had earned him the humanitarian award, though Richard would never admit the private truth that the entire endeavor had begun as a tax strategy recommended by his financial advisors. What had started as a savvy business move had evolved into something more meaningful, especially after Catherine's involvement. She had thrown herself into the project with genuine passion, perhaps compensating for the emptiness of their childless home. Mr. Harrington, a lounge attendant, approached with deference. "We'll begin boarding your flight shortly. May I escort you and Mrs. Harrington to the gate?" As Richard nodded and helped Catherine to her feet across the terminal, Elijah was already queued in the long boarding line, reviewing medical terminology on flashcards he'd created himself. The worn edges testified to countless hours of study. "Pulmonary embolism," he whispered to himself. "Symptoms include sudden shortness of breath, chest pain, rapid heart rate." He flipped to the next card, unaware that this particular condition would become horrifyingly relevant in the hours to come. The boarding process emphasized the divide between their worlds. The Harringtons were welcomed aboard with differential smiles, settled into spacious first-class pods with champagne for Richard and sparkling water for Catherine. Elijah shuffled down the narrow aisle of economy, squeezing past other passengers to find his middle seat, sandwiched between a heavy-set businessman who immediately claimed both armrests and an elderly woman already nodding off against the window. As the plane taxied and then launched into the darkening sky, none of them could have predicted how their carefully separated worlds were about to collide, or how assumptions and prejudices would soon be laid bare at $35,000 a fee, where there was nowhere to hide and no one to call but each other. 4 hours into the transatlantic flight, with the sky outside having transitioned from dusk to complete darkness, most passengers had settled into the liminal space that long flights create, a suspension between departure and arrival, between one life and another. The cabin lights had been dimmed, the background hum of the engines a lullaby that had lulled many to sleep. Elijah remained awake, too keyed up about the interview that awaited him in London. He'd managed to negotiate a bathroom break past his now snoring seatmates and was standing in the rear of the plane, stretching his long legs and reviewing his notes one more time by the soft glow of the galley lights. "You should try to get some sleep, honey," advised an older flight attendant as she organized a beverage cart. Her name tag read Gloria, and the crow's feet around her eyes crinkled kindly. "Still got a long flight ahead." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied with the reflexive politeness his grandmother had instilled in him. "Just a little nervous. First time flying." "Well, you picked a doozy for your first time." "Transatlantic," Gloria chuckled. "Where you headed?" "London got some family waiting." "No family, ma'am. I'm interviewing for a medical program for high school students interested in becoming doctors." Something in Gloria's expression shifted subtly, surprise followed by a warm approval that Elijah rarely received from strangers. "Well, now that's something. My grandson's about your age, more interested in video games than anything else." A call light illuminated on her panel, cutting their conversation short. "Duty calls, first class, probably wanting more champagne. Those folks up front, they don't sleep much either." She winked and pushed her cart forward. Elijah returned to his seat, carefully maneuvering past his still-sleeping rowmates. As he settled in, he couldn't help but wonder about the people in first class with their champagne and fully reclining seats. People like the elegant couple he'd seen at the airport. What did they worry about? Certainly not how to stretch $20 for 2 days in London while waiting for the program's meal stipend to kick in. In first class, Catherine Harrington shifted uncomfortably in her pod. Despite the spaciousness and the nearly flat recline position, she couldn't find relief from the persistent ache in her lower back. She'd been experiencing occasional dizziness throughout the day, but had attributed it to the normal discomforts of pregnancy. Now, as she pressed a hand against her chest, she felt an unfamiliar tightness. "Richard," she whispered, not wanting to wake him if he'd finally fallen asleep. Her husband had been so vigilant, so worried throughout this pregnancy that she'd found herself downplaying her discomfort to spare him additional anxiety. Richard stirred immediately, years of light sleep from business concerns, making him instantly alert. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Probably nothing," Catherine said, trying to sound reassuring despite the growing pressure in her chest. "Just feeling a little breathless." Richard immediately pressed the call button, his face betraying the concern he tried to mask with a calm voice. "Let's have the flight attendant bring you some water. Dr. Winters said to stay hydrated." Gloria appeared moments later, her professional smile faltering slightly as she registered Catherine's pallor. "Mrs. Harrington, are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine. Just—" Catherine paused, a sharper pain interrupting her words. Her hand flew to her chest. "Actually, I'm having trouble catching my breath." Gloria's expression turned serious. She reached for Catherine's wrist, checking her pulse with practiced efficiency. "How far along are you, Mrs. Harrington?" 28 weeks, Richard answered for her, his voice tight. "Is something wrong? Should we be concerned?" "I'm going to get our first aid kit and see if there's a doctor on board," Gloria said calmly, though her quickened pace betrayed her concern. "Just try to relax and take slow breaths, Mrs. Harrington." As Gloria moved swiftly through the cabin, making a discreet announcement, requesting medical assistance, Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her breathing became more labored, a sheen of sweat breaking out across her forehead despite the cabin's cool temperature. "Richard," she gasped, genuine fear in her eyes. "Something's wrong. The baby." Richard clutched her hand, his composed exterior crumbling. "Help!" he called out, his voice carrying through the hushed cabin. "My wife needs help." The commotion rippled through the plane, pulling drowsy passengers from their sleep. In economy, Elijah was jolted awake by the increasing murmurs and movement in the aisles. He heard snippets of worried conversation. Pregnant woman, first-class breathing problems. A second flight attendant hurried past his row, carrying what looked like an emergency medical kit. "Is there a doctor on board?" she called out, scanning the faces in the economy cabin after apparently finding no medical personnel in business or first class. Elijah felt a cold wave of recognition wash over him. The symptoms being described in hurried whispers around him, shortness of breath, chest pain, pregnancy triggered an alarm bell in his mind. His grandmother had experienced similar symptoms during a frightening episode the previous year. Though without the pregnancy complication, the diagnosis had been a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lungs. Pregnancy increased the risk significantly. He'd read that in one of his medical books. He hesitated, doubt holding him back. Who would listen to a teenager? What if he was wrong? But the continued calls for medical help and the escalating urgency in the flight attendants' voices propelled him to action. Standing up, Elijah raised his hand. "I'm not a doctor," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "but I might know what's happening." The flight attendant barely glanced his way. "We need a medical professional, young man. Please stay seated. It could be a pulmonary embolism." Elijah persisted louder this time. "Pregnancy increases the risk by 5 times. Does she have swelling in one leg? Is she gasping between words?" This time, the flight attendant paused, registering both his words and his youth with surprise. "How do you? My grandmother had one last year. I helped care for her. She has COPD and heart failure." The words tumbled out as Elijah moved into the aisle. "If it is a PE, she needs oxygen immediately and possibly blood thinners. Do you have aspirin in the medical kit?" For a moment, the flight attendant seemed torn between protocol and the confident authority in the young man's voice. Then a more urgent call from the front of the plane made the decision for her. "Come with me," she said brusquely. "But if you're wrong—" "I pray I am," Elijah said, following her toward first class, acutely aware of the curious and skeptical gazes following him. The scene that greeted him in first class was chaos contained within luxury. Catherine Harrington lay reclined in her pod, her complexion ashen, her breathing shallow and rapid. Richard hovered beside her, his face a mask of helpless terror. Gloria was attempting to place an oxygen mask over Catherine's face, but the woman was becoming increasingly agitated, gasping that she couldn't breathe even with it. Richard looked up as Elijah approached, confusion and desperation warring in his expression. "Who's this? Where's the doctor?" "There's no doctor on board, sir," the flight attendant explained. "This young man says he might know what's happening." Richard's eyes narrowed, taking in Elijah's youth, his casual clothes, his race, making calculations and judgments, as he'd been conditioned to do throughout his life in the upper echelons of finance. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have entrusted this boy with getting his coffee order right, let alone his wife's life. But these weren't normal circumstances. "What's wrong with my wife?" he demanded, his tone a complex mixture of authority and plea. Elijah swallowed, pushing down his awareness of the man's skepticism. "Sir, I think she might have a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in her lungs. The symptoms match and pregnancy increases the risk, especially during air travel." "And you know this how exactly?" Richard's voice was taut with suspicion. "I take care of my grandmother. She has similar health issues. I've been studying medicine since I was 12. Elijah moved closer to Catherine, addressing her directly with gentle authority. "Ma'am, do you have pain or swelling in one leg?" "Maybe started before the flight." Catherine nodded weakly, gesturing to her left calf. Since yesterday, she managed between labored breaths. Thought it was normal pregnancy swelling. Elijah turned to Gloria. "We need to elevate her legs, give her oxygen, and if you have aspirin in the medical kit, she should take one." It's a blood thinner. Also, check if there's any injectable blood thinners like heparin. Some advanced kits have them. Gloria exchanged glances with her colleague, then nodded decisively. I'll check the kit. Emily, notify the captain we may need to divert. Richard watched in stunned silence as the teenager gently helped reposition his wife, explaining each move with a calm confidence that seemed incongruous with his youth. The clot probably formed in her leg, Elijah explained, gesturing to Catherine's swollen calf while maintaining eye contact with her, to keep her focused and calm. Sometimes they break loose and travel to the lungs. The aspirin will help prevent it from getting bigger while we get you to a hospital. How do you know all this? Richard asked again, but the accusatory edge had been replaced by something closer to wonder. Elijah finally looked up, meeting the older man's gaze directly. Because I had to know, my grandmother, she depends on me. He turned back to Catherine. The oxygen will help Mrs. Harrington. Try to take slow, deep breaths if you can. In that suspended moment, as the plane continued its journey across the dark Atlantic, and a wealthy businessman watched a black teenager he would have typically ignored potentially saving his wife's life, something shifted imperceptibly in the fabric of both their worlds. Neither could have articulated it yet, but in the artificial bubble of the aircraft cabin, the carefully constructed barriers of class, race, and assumption had begun to crack. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing they would be making an emergency landing in Iceland, the nearest location with adequate medical facilities. As the plane changed course, banking slightly northward, Catherine's breathing eased somewhat with the oxygen and aspirin, but her condition remained precarious. The baby, however, was showing signs of distress, its heartbeat racing as detected by a portable fetal monitor in the emergency kit. Throughout the tense hour that followed, Elijah remained by Catherine's side, monitoring her vital signs with the limited equipment available and providing clear, constant updates to both Richard and the flight crew. His presence seemed to steady Catherine, whose panic had initially worsened her condition. My grandmother always says panic uses oxygen we can't spare, he told her with a gentle smile. So we're going to stay calm together, you and me and your baby. Richard, watching this interaction, struggled with a complex wash of emotions. Relief that someone seemed to know what to do, battled with the uncomfortable realization that he had immediately discounted this young man based solely on appearance. As the minutes passed and his wife's condition had stabilized somewhat under Elijah's care, gratitude began to overshadow everything else. What's your name? Richard asked finally, his voice rough with emotion. Elijah. Elijah Williams, sir. Thank you, Elijah, Richard said, the words inadequate for the weight he tried to convey. I don't know what would have happened if— Don't thank me yet, sir, Elijah interrupted gently. She needs proper medical care as soon as possible. The baby, too. He hesitated, then added, I was supposed to be interviewing at the Young Medical Achievers program in London tomorrow morning. Guess that's not happening now. Something flickered across Richard's face. Recognition, perhaps, of the sacrifices being made in this moment that extended beyond his own family crisis. But before he could respond, the plane began its descent toward Reykjavik, and all attention returned to preparing Catherine for the emergency landing and the medical team that would be waiting. As the wheels touched down on Icelandic soil, none of them could have predicted how the next 24 hours would unfold, or how a request made in a hospital waiting room would change the trajectory of all their lives. The fluorescent lights of Landsbadatali University Hospital cast a harsh glow over the waiting room, erasing the distinctions of class and privilege that had separated Richard Harrington from Elijah Williams just hours before. Both sat on identical, uncomfortable plastic chairs, an untouched cup of vending machine coffee cooling between Richard's manicured hands. Catherine had been rushed into emergency care immediately upon arrival. A team of doctors confirming Elijah's diagnosis of pulmonary embolism complicated by pregnancy. The medical staff had been impressed by the quick intervention on the plane, the lead doctor telling Richard that the aspirin and oxygen had likely prevented a much worse outcome. The next 24 hours will be critical, the doctor had explained in accented but fluent English. We have her on proper anticoagulants now, and we're monitoring the baby closely. She's stable, but not out of danger. Now in the sterile limbo of the waiting room, Richard found himself studying the young man who sat several chairs away, fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. In the harsh hospital lighting, Elijah looked even younger than he had on the plane. Barely more than a child, really. The sparse beginnings of facial hair and the adult confidence of his medical knowledge at odds with the youth in his face. "You should get some rest," Richard said, eventually breaking the silence. "There's nothing more to be done tonight." Elijah looked up, shadows under his eyes. "I'm okay, sir. I'd like to know she's going to be all right." Richard nodded, a lump forming unexpectedly in his throat. This boy had no obligation to Catherine, no connection to either of them. Yet here he sat at 2 a.m. in a foreign country, having missed the opportunity he'd traveled so far to pursue. "Tell me about this program," Richard said. "The one in London." Elijah straightened slightly, a spark returning to his tired eyes. "Young medical achievers, it's an international program for high school students planning medical careers. Only 50 students worldwide get accepted each year." His voice took on a quiet pride. "The interviews are tomorrow. I mean, today now. The program offers full scholarships to college for the top 10 participants. And you're missing it because of us," Richard stated flatly. Elijah shrugged, but the disappointment was evident beneath his attempt at nonchalance. "Some things matter more. My grandmother would say the same." Richard fell silent again, turning the paper coffee cup in his hands. The mention of Elijah's grandmother triggered memories of the boy's earlier comments on the plane. "I take care of my grandmother. She depends on me." It painted a picture so at odds with Richard's initial assumptions about the teenager. "You mentioned caring for your grandmother," Richard prompted after a moment, genuinely curious now. "She has health problems, COPD, congestive heart failure, and arthritis that's getting worse," Elijah replied matter-of-factly, rather than seeking sympathy. "Been taking care of her since my mom passed 3 years ago. Just the two of us now." Richard absorbed this information, mentally reconstructing his understanding of the young man before him. Not a boy, really, despite his youth. Someone who had shouldered adult responsibilities far earlier than most, and the medical knowledge that's from caring for her. Elijah nodded. "Had to learn fast. Our neighborhood doesn't have the best access to healthcare. When Mom got sick, breast cancer, I started reading everything I could find after she died. Kept going. Grandma says, I got a gift for it." A faint smile. "She works too hard to make sure I can keep studying, takes in sewing, even with her arthritis. That's why this program mattered so much. Would have meant a full ride to medical school eventually." The matter-of-fact recitation of hardship delivered without self-pity struck Richard more forcefully than any emotional appeal could have. Here was a young man who had faced more adversity in 17 years than Richard had in his entire privileged life. Yet he sat in this sterile waiting room, concerned about a stranger's wife rather than his own derailed opportunity. "I've been unfair to you," Richard admitted abruptly, the words surprising even himself. "On the plane, I saw—" He stopped, uncomfortable with naming his own prejudice. "I know what you saw, sir," Elijah said quietly without accusation. "I'm used to it." The simple statement hung in the air between them, an indictment more powerful for its resignation. Before Richard could respond, a doctor appeared at the waiting room entrance. "Mr. Harrington, your wife is asking for you," and the doctor consulted his clipboard. "She's also asking for Elijah," said he was a young man who helped her on the plane. Both rose immediately, following the doctor through the labyrinthine corridors. Catherine had been moved from emergency care to a private room, multiple monitors tracking her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat providing a reassuring background rhythm. She looked pale against the white hospital sheets, but her breathing was clearly easier, the blue tint gone from her lips. Her eyes brightened as the two entered. "My heroes," she said, her voice weak but warm. "They told me what you did, Elijah, that you recognized what was happening when no one else could." Elijah ducked his head, suddenly shy in the face of her gratitude. "Anyone with the same knowledge would have done the same, ma'am. But no one else had that knowledge," she insisted, reaching out a hand. After a moment's hesitation, Elijah stepped forward to take it. "The doctor said, without the quick intervention on the plane I might have—" She stopped, her free hand moving protectively to her belly. "Both of us might have been lost." Richard moved to her other side. bending to kiss her forehead. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Better. They say the clot is dissolving with the medication. The baby's heart rate has stabilized." She squeezed Elijah's hand before releasing it. "Richard told me you missed your interview for a medical program because of our emergency." Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "It's not important right now." "It is important," Catherine insisted. "Richard says it could have meant a scholarship your future." "There will be other opportunities," Elijah said, though the slight tightening of his jaw suggested he didn't entirely believe it. Richard watched this exchange, a decision crystallizing in his mind. "You should get some rest," he told Catherine. "The doctor says you'll need to remain here for observation for at least 2 days. I've arranged for us to stay at a hotel nearby." He turned to Elijah. "You too. The airline has provided accommodations for all the passengers while they arrange alternative flights. I've made sure you have a room as well." "Thank you, sir," Elijah said, the formality still firmly in place despite the intense circumstances they had shared. "I should call my grandmother, let her know what's happened. She'll be worried when I don't check in from London." As Elijah stepped out to make his call, Richard lingered by Catherine's bedside, an unfamiliar turmoil of thoughts churning within him. In the span of a few hours, his carefully ordered world view had been disrupted by this chance encounter with a young man who defied every unconscious assumption he'd made. "He's remarkable," Catherine murmured, reading his expression. "So young, but so capable. And to think if he hadn't been on that flight," she didn't complete the thought. Richard nodded, squeezing her hand. "Get some sleep. I'll be right here." As Catherine drifted off, Richard found himself contemplating privilege, opportunity, and debt. Not financial debt, which he understood intimately as the foundation of his business empire, but moral debt, the kind that couldn't be repaid with a simple thank you or even a generous check. Outside in the hallway, Elijah leaned against the wall, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried to reassure his grandmother. The program administrators in London had been sympathetic but clear. Without attending the in-person interview, his application was effectively withdrawn. There would be other years, they said, though the age limit of 18 meant this had been his only chance. He didn't share this detail with his grandmother, focusing instead on the positive news that he'd been able to help someone in need. "You did right, baby," Beatrice Williams said, her voice crackling with both pride and the effects of her respiratory condition. "Always told you that knowledge you got is a gift meant for sharing." "I know, Grandma," Elijah replied, swallowing hard against the disappointment he wouldn't burden her with. "I'll be home soon." As he ended the call, Elijah looked up to find Richard Harrington watching him from the doorway of Catherine's room, an unreadable expression on his face. For a moment, the two regarded each other in silence. The millionaire and the teenager, connected by circumstance and separated by nearly everything else. Neither could have predicted the conversation that would unfold between them the following day, or the request that would bring unexpected tears to Richard Harrington's eyes, forcing him to confront biases he had never acknowledged, and opening a door to redemption he hadn't known he needed. Morning in Reykjavik brought a watery sunlight that did little to warm the pristine cold air. Richard had spent most of the night in an uncomfortable chair beside Catherine's hospital bed, dozing fitfully between nurses' checks and his own anxious monitoring of the machines tracking his wife and unborn child's vital signs. Catherine's condition had stabilized significantly overnight. The anticoagulant medication was dissolving the clot in her lungs, and while she would need continued treatment throughout her pregnancy, the doctors were cautiously optimistic about her prognosis. The baby, remarkably, showed no signs of distress now. "You look terrible," Catherine told Richard as she picked at the unfamiliar Icelandic breakfast that had been delivered to her room. "Go back to the hotel, shower, eat something that isn't from a vending machine." Richard ran a hand over his stubbled jaw. "I don't want to leave you. I'm fine." "We're fine," she said, patting her belly. "But you need rest if you're going to be any use to us." Her expression softened. "And Richard, find Elijah before he leaves. I want to do something for him, something meaningful. He saved our lives." Richard nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead before departing. The hospital corridors were busier now, the daytime shift bringing increased activity and the babel of Icelandic conversations punctuated by occasional English from other stranded passengers from their flight who were receiving treatment for less serious issues. Outside, the crisp air revived him somewhat as he waited for the taxi the hospital staff had called. His phone buzzed with messages from his London office, inquiries about the humanitarian awards ceremony he had been scheduled to attend, concerns about Catherine's condition, the familiar demands of his world rushing back in, yet they seemed strangely distant now, as if the events of the past 24 hours had created a buffer between him and his former priorities. The hotel where the airline had arranged accommodations for passengers was modest by Richard's standards, but clean and efficient. As he crossed the lobby, he spotted a familiar figure seated alone in the small attached cafe, bent over a cup of coffee and a notebook. Elijah looked up as Richard approached, quickly closing what appeared to be a journal. "Mr. Harrington, how is Mrs. Harrington this morning?" "Much better, thanks to you," Richard said, gesturing to the empty chair across from Elijah. "May I?" "Of course." Elijah straightened, his expression guarded yet polite. Richard signaled a waitress for coffee before turning his full attention to the young man across from him. In the daylight, with the immediate crisis past, he could observe Elijah more carefully. The teenager's clothes were worn but meticulously clean, his posture impeccable despite evident fatigue. There was a dignity in his bearing that reminded Richard of his own father, who had worked as a janitor to put himself through night school before eventually founding the small investment firm that Richard had later built into an empire. "The airline is arranging return flights for all passengers," Richard began. "They should have details later today." Elijah nodded. "I checked already. There's a flight back to New York tomorrow morning." "That's good." Richard accepted his coffee from the waitress, using the moment to gather his thoughts. "Elijah, I want to talk to you about compensation." The word hung awkwardly between them. Elijah's expression closed further, a weariness entering his eyes that made Richard realize his mistake immediately. "That came out wrong," Richard amended quickly. "I'm not trying to. What I mean is, you're owed something for what you did, for what you lost because of us." "I'm not owed anything, Mr. Harrington," Elijah replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I did what anyone should have done." "But not what anyone could have done," Richard countered, "and it cost you an opportunity that was clearly important to you." Elijah was silent for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "My grandmother always says, opportunities come and go, but doing right isn't optional." The simple statement delivered without pretense stirred something in Richard, a memory of similar words from his own father, perhaps, or a recognition of the kind of principled character that his wealth had insulated him from encountering in recent decades. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Richard said softly. "I'd like to meet her someday." Surprise flickered across Elijah's face before he controlled it. "She'd like that, I think. She's always telling me I need to meet more kinds of people, see more of the world." "Is that why you applied to the program in London?" "Partly, mostly because medical school is expensive, and we don't have that kind of money." Elijah's candor was refreshing in its directness. The scholarship would have made the difference. Richard nodded, a decision solidifying in his mind. "I want to help you, Elijah. Not as payment, but as recognition of who you are, what you're capable of, the kind of doctor you could become." For the first time, Elijah's careful composure showed a crack, a flicker of hope quickly suppressed. "That's very generous, Mr. Harrington." "But let me finish," Richard said, leaning forward. "I have connections at several medical schools, financial resources that could ensure you get the education you deserve. Consider it an investment in a future physician. That's what I do, you know. Invest in promising futures." He watched as Elijah absorbed this offer, conflicting emotions playing across the young man's face. Pride weared visibly with practicality, dignity with need. "Take some time to think about it," Richard added. "Talk to your grandmother." "This isn't charity, Elijah. It's recognition of merit, something you've earned through years of dedication and natural ability." He pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. "My private number is on the back. Whatever you decide, I want to hear from you." Elijah took the card carefully, studying it before slipping it into his pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I will think about it." He hesitated, then added, But there's something else I wanted to ask you about. Not for me, but for my grandmother. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. What about her? She needs better medical care than she's getting. Our insurance barely covers the basics, and the specialists she needs keep referring her around because they don't take Medicaid patients. Elijah's voice remained level, but his hands betrayed his emotion, clasping tightly on the table. If you really want to help, that would mean more to me than any scholarship. The request caught Richard off guard. He had expected what? A request for cash, perhaps? Connections to the medical program he'd missed. Instead, here was this remarkable young man asking not for himself, but for the grandmother who had raised him. Of course, Richard said immediately. I can arrange for the best care available, specialists, treatments, whatever she needs. Elijah shook his head slowly. It's not just about money or connections, Mr. Harrington. It's about how the system works or doesn't work for people like my grandmother. She's not the only one in our neighborhood struggling to get basic care. There's a community clinic that tries, but they're understaffed, underfunded. Richard listened as Elijah spoke with quiet passion about the healthcare disparities in his Harlem neighborhood, the elderly residents who couldn't navigate the complex insurance systems, the families choosing between medication and food. The young man's perspective was both intimate, shaped by personal experience, and surprisingly sophisticated in its understanding of systemic issues. As Elijah spoke, Richard felt something shift inside him. The humanitarian award waiting in London suddenly seemed hollow, a recognition of tax-deductible donations rather than meaningful change. Here was a young man who understood the true meaning of service in a way Richard's wealth had insulated him from ever needing to learn. What would make a real difference? Richard asked when Elijah finally paused. Not just for your grandmother, but for your community. Elijah's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised by the scope of the question. Honestly, a properly funded community health center with specialists who actually live in or care about the neighborhood. People who see patients as people, not insurance codes, transportation assistance for the elderly and disabled, medication support programs. He shrugged. But that's big picture stuff beyond what I was asking for. Maybe it shouldn't be, Richard said thoughtfully. My foundation is finalizing plans for a medical center in Rwanda. Important work, don't get me wrong, but I've never considered something similar right in New York. The need exists in both places, Elijah said carefully. Just because America's wealthy doesn't mean all Americans are. The simple truth of this statement hit Richard with unexpected force. How many times had he flown over Harlem on his way to JFK, never giving a thought to the communities below? How often had he donated to international causes while ignoring disparities in his own city? Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Catherine's doctor requesting his return to the hospital for a consultation. He stood suddenly reluctant to end this conversation that had opened unexpected doors in his thinking. I need to get back to Catherine, but this isn't finished, Elijah. What you've said, it matters. It's given me a lot to think about. He extended his hand, which Elijah rose to shake. Will you come to the hospital later? Catherine would like to see you before we all leave tomorrow. Elijah nodded. I'd like that. Please tell Mrs. Harrington I'm glad she's doing better. As Richard left the hotel, his mind was racing with new possibilities. The Rwanda project was already funded, already in motion, but perhaps there was room for a parallel initiative closer to home. Not as a replacement, but as a complement, a recognition that need existed everywhere, sometimes in places he had trained himself not to see. By the time he reached Catherine's hospital room, the outlines of a plan were forming in his mind, a plan that would transform not just Elijah's life or his grandmother's care, but potentially an entire community, and perhaps, though he was only beginning to recognize it, a plan that might transform Richard himself in the process. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hospital windows as Richard sat beside Catherine's bed, explaining his conversation with Elijah. She listened intently, her eyes brightening with each detail. So his request wasn't for himself at all, she marveled. Just better care for his grandmother. Not even a direct request for her alone, Richard clarified. He spoke about the whole system, the community clinic, transportation issues for elderly patients, medication costs. He shook his head, still processing his own reaction. Catherine, listening to him, I realized how narrow our philanthropy has been. Well-intentioned but distant, Catherine supplied, safe. Richard nodded, recognizing the truth in her assessment. Their charitable giving had always been carefully managed, strategically aligned with business interests, focused on causes that garnered positive press and networking opportunities with other wealthy donors. Even the Rwanda Medical Center, their most ambitious project to date, had begun as a tax strategy before Catherine's genuine passion had transformed it into something more meaningful. I want to do something different, Richard said, taking her hand. Something closer to home. Something Elijah helped me see. Catherine squeezed his fingers. Tell me. As Richard outlined his emerging idea, a comprehensive community health initiative in Harlem, with Elijah's neighborhood as the pilot location. Catherine's expression grew more animated than he'd seen since before her medical crisis. This is perfect, Richard, she said when he'd finished. Not just for Elijah and his grandmother, but for us, too. For the baby. She placed her free hand on her belly. I want our child to grow up understanding that privilege comes with responsibility. Real responsibility, not just writing checks from a distance. A knock at the door interrupted them. Elijah stood in the doorway, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the hospital setting, despite his evident medical knowledge. Elijah. Catherine's face lit up. Come in, please. The doctors say I'm doing much better thanks to you. Elijah entered carrying a small gift shop bouquet that seemed to embarrass him slightly as he presented it. Just wanted to bring something. My grandmother always says never visit someone in the hospital empty-handed. It's lovely, Catherine assured him, accepting the flowers with genuine warmth. And speaking of your grandmother, Richard has been telling me about your conversation this morning. Elijah glanced between them, his expression guarded. I hope I didn't overstep. Quite the opposite, Richard interrupted, standing to offer Elijah the chair closest to Catherine. You've given me a new perspective, one I should have had long ago. As Elijah cautiously took the offered seat, Richard remained standing, suddenly energized by the plan taking shape in his mind. Elijah, what would you think about helping us design a new kind of community health initiative, starting with your neighborhood, but potentially expanding to other underserved areas in New York? Elijah's expression shifted from caution to confusion. Sir, the Harrington Foundation has resources that could make a real difference, Richard continued. But what we lack is insight, the kind you have from living in the community, from caring for your grandmother, from seeing the gaps in the system firsthand. I don't understand, Elijah said slowly. You want my advice? More than advice, Catherine interjected, her eyes bright with the same enthusiasm Richard felt. We want your partnership, your vision. You know what your community actually needs, not what outsiders think it needs. Richard watched as Elijah processed this unexpected proposal, the young man's expressions cycling through disbelief, caution, and tentative hope. This would be a paid position, of course, Richard added, compatible with your studies, and it would include a full scholarship for your medical education, not as charity, but as investment in someone who will bring crucial perspective to the initiative, and full medical care for your grandmother, Catherine added softly. Immediately the best specialists, whatever she needs. Elijah sat very still, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but thick with emotion. Why would you do this? You don't even know me. The question hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Richard exchanged a glance with Catherine before answering. Because what you did on that plane wasn't just about medical knowledge, he said carefully. It was about seeing beyond appearances and assumptions. It was about moral courage, stepping forward when it would have been easier to stay silent. He paused, finding himself on unfamiliar emotional ground. I've been successful in business partially because I'm good at evaluating people quickly. But on that plane, I evaluated you wrong. I saw a kid who couldn't possibly have anything to offer in a crisis. I was wrong, and that mistake could have cost me everything I truly care about. Catherine reached for Elijah's hand. What Richard is trying to say is that meeting you has made us reconsider what matters, what we want our legacy to be. This child, she touched her belly, will be born into privilege, We want to make sure that privilege is used to connect, not separate. Elijah looked down at Catherine's hand, covering his own, then up at Richard, his expression open and vulnerable in a way it hadn't been before. My grandmother always said, God puts people in your path for a reason. A small smile. She also says, look, gift horses straighten the mouth and count their teeth. But I think she'd make an exception in this case. The tension in the room broke, all three of them laughing at the unexpected idiom. So that's a yes? Richard asked, finding himself genuinely anxious for the answer. It's a yes, Elijah confirmed, his smile growing. But I have conditions. This can't be just about my grandmother or me. The initiative has to involve local community leaders from the beginning, and it can't be a short-term project that disappears when the next interesting cause comes along. Agreed, Richard said without hesitation, impressed yet again by the young man's maturity and perspective. We'll draw up a proper proposal with your input. Long-term commitment, community leadership, transparency in all decisions. Catherine beamed between them, then grimaced slightly as she shifted position. The momentary discomfort reminded all of them of the fragility of the connection that had brought them together. How easily things might have gone differently if Elijah hadn't been on that flight, if he hadn't spoken up, if Richard hadn't finally listened. There's one more thing, Elijah said, hesitation returning to his voice. My grandmother, she'd want to meet you both before I agree to anything final. She's old school that way. We'd be honored, Catherine said immediately, as soon as I'm cleared to travel. Richard nodded agreement, though he found himself unexpectedly nervous at the prospect of meeting the woman who had raised such a remarkable young man. A woman who might see through the veneer of wealth and status to the flawed human being beneath. It was a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to feel in his carefully controlled world. As the conversation continued, plans taking shape for what would eventually become the Harlem Community Health Initiative, Richard found himself watching Elijah, the animation in his features as he described his neighborhood, the precise intelligence in his suggestions, the fundamental decency that seemed to guide his every thought. In that hospital room in Reykjavik, with ice crystals forming patterns on the windows and the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor, something profound was shifting. Not just a business arrangement or a philanthropic initiative, but a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the barriers Richard had never even acknowledged building around his life. Later, as they prepared to part ways until their rescheduled flight the following day, Richard found himself alone with Elijah in the hospital corridor. I have a confession to make, Richard said quietly. When you first came to help Catherine on the plane, I didn't trust you. I made assumptions based on, he faltered, uncomfortable with naming his own prejudice. Based on what I look like, Elijah finished for him, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. I know, Mr. Harrington. I've dealt with those assumptions my whole life. I'm sorry, Richard said simply, the words inadequate but sincere. Elijah studied him for a moment before responding. My grandmother says ignorance can be fixed with knowledge, but only if you're willing to learn. A small smile. Seems like you're willing. The simple absolution offered without fanfare brought an unexpected lump to Richard's throat. He extended his hand, and when Elijah took it, he pulled the young man into a brief, awkward embrace. Thank you, Richard said, stepping back and clearing his throat, embarrassed by his own emotion. Not just for Catherine and the baby, but for opening my eyes a bit. Elijah nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. See you tomorrow, Mr. Harrington. As Richard watched the young man walk away down the sterile hospital corridor, he felt a certainty he rarely experienced outside of business decisions. Their chance encounter on that transatlantic flight wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The first chapter of a story that would continue to unfold long after they returned to New York. A story that would change not just Elijah's community, but Richard himself in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. If you've been moved by this story of unexpected connection across social divides, please consider subscribing to our channel and commenting below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what resonated most with you. 2 weeks later, Richard Harrington's sleek black Bentley rolled slowly through the streets of Harlem, drawing curious glances from residents unaccustomed to seeing such luxury in their neighborhood. In the back seat, Catherine sat beside Richard, her pregnancy now showing prominently as she entered her third trimester. The medical crisis in Iceland seemed almost dreamlike now, though her daily anticoagulant injections served as a constant reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. "Are you nervous?" she asked, noticing the unusual tension in her husband's posture. Richard Harrington routinely negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. Yet today he fidgeted with his cufflinks like a schoolboy before an exam. "A little," he admitted. "It feels important to make a good impression." Catherine covered his hand with hers. "Just be yourself. The real self I know, not the Harrington Financial Group CEO self." The car pulled up in front of a modest apartment building with a broken elevator sign posted at the entrance. Richard stared up at the weathered facade, mentally calculating the property's value compared to their Manhattan penthouse. The disparity was staggering, another layer of reality he had never had to confront directly. Elijah waited for them at the entrance, his face breaking into a genuine smile as they emerged from the car. He looked different here in his home environment, more relaxed, more himself in jeans and a faded Howard University sweatshirt that had clearly belonged to someone larger, perhaps his late mother. "Welcome to our neighborhood," he said, extending a hand to help Catherine from the car. "Grandma's excited to meet you both. Fair warning, she's made enough food for about 20 people." As they climbed the 5 flights of stairs to the Williams apartment, Richard insisting on carrying the gift baskets they'd brought despite Elijah's protests, the physical reality of Elijah's daily life became clear. This was a building where the elevator had been broken for months, where residents with disabilities like Beatrice Williams were effectively trapped in their homes without assistance. "Grandma hasn't been outside in almost 3 weeks, Elijah explained quietly, as they paused for Catherine to catch her breath on the 4th-floor landing. "The oxygen tank is too heavy for her to manage on the stairs alone, and I've had school and work." Richard made a mental note to add building infrastructure to the Community Health Initiative scope. What good was medical care if patients couldn't physically access it? The apartment door opened before they could knock, revealing Beatrice Williams waiting with dignified expectancy, oxygen tubes in her nose attached to a portable tank, but dressed as if for church in a pressed floral dress and carefully styled silver hair. "So these are your airplane people," she said to Elijah, her deep voice warm despite the assessing look she gave the Harringtons. Come in. Don't stand in the hallway letting all the heat out." The apartment was small but immaculately kept with furniture from an earlier era polished to a shine. Family photos lined the walls, a younger Beatrix with a woman who was clearly Elijah's mother, Elijah at various ages. School portraits showing his progression from a gap to child to the serious young man he was becoming. The rich aroma of home cooking filled the space, a welcome mingling of cornbread, greens, and something sweet bubbling on the stove. "Mrs. Williams, thank you for inviting us into your home," Richard said formally, finding himself unexpectedly intimidated by this elderly woman's penetrating gaze. "We brought a few things," he gestured awkwardly to the gift baskets. "Set those down and come sit," Beatrice instructed, waving toward the sofa. "We'll get to gifts later. First, I want to look at the people my grandson saved." Her direct approach was softened by the pride evident in her glance toward Elijah, who was helping Catherine to the most comfortable chair. As they settled in the small living room, Beatrix studied Catherine with particular attention. "You look better than Elijah described from the airplane. Good color in your cheeks now. How's the baby doing?" "Strong," Catherine replied, warming immediately to Beatrix's straightforward manner. "The doctors say there's no sign of any lasting effects from what happened. We're incredibly grateful to Elijah if he hadn't recognized what was happening. The Lord puts knowledge where it's needed," Beatrice said simply. "Been telling this boy since he was knee-high that his brain was a gift meant for service." She turned her assessing gaze to Richard. "Now, Mr. Millionaire Man, Elijah tells me you're planning some kind of health program for the neighborhood?" Richard, caught off guard by the direct address, found himself stumbling over the practiced explanation he'd prepared. "Yes, that is, the Harrington Foundation we want to establish a comprehensive community health initiative, starting with this neighborhood as a pilot. Elijah's insights have been invaluable in helping us understand the real needs." Hmm, Beatrice interrupted, unimpressed by corporate language. And why here? Plenty of poor neighborhoods in New York. Why suddenly interested in Harlem? The question cut through pretense, demanding honesty. Richard glanced at Elijah, who watched the exchange with careful neutrality, then at Catherine, who gave him an encouraging nod. Because Elijah made me see what I'd been choosing not to see, Richard admitted, abandoning his prepared speech. I've lived in New York my entire life, made my fortune here, but I behaved as if places like this neighborhood didn't exist, except as statistics and charitable giving reports. He looked directly at Beatrice. Your grandson didn't just save my wife and child, Mrs. Williams. He made me question things I've never questioned before. Beatrice held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, she laughed, a deep, rich sound that transformed her stern countenance. Well, honesty at last. I can work with honesty. She turned to Elijah. This one might not be as hopeless as most rich folks might actually learn something. The tension in the room dissolved, Elijah's relieved smile matching Catherine's. Richard felt as if he'd passed some crucial test without fully understanding its parameters. Now, Beatrice continued briskly, before we eat, I want to know exactly what you're planning. No corporate double talk, plain English. What are you going to do? When are you going to do it? And how are you going to make sure it doesn't disappear when you find some other cause that catches your fancy? Over the next hour, as they moved to the small dining table laden with more food than the four of them could possibly consume, Richard outlined the emerging plan for the Community Health Initiative. With Beatrix probing questions, stripping away any remaining corporate veneer, the conversation became increasingly practical and specific. Transportation services for elderly and disabled residents, a renovated community clinic staffed by doctors with cultural competency training, medication assistance programs, preventative care outreach. And you want Elijah involved how exactly? Beatrice asked, serving Catherine a second helping of sweet potato pie despite her protests that she couldn't eat another bite. In any way he's willing to be, Richard answered honestly. His perspective is invaluable. We've offered him a formal paid advisory role that would work around his school schedule, leading to a full medical school scholarship. Beatrice nodded slowly. And the catch? There's always a catch. No catch, Mrs. Williams? Catherine interjected gently. What Elijah did for us, there's no price tag we could put on that. This isn't payment. It's recognition of his exceptional abilities and character. Abilities that might never have gotten the support they deserve in a system that she hesitated, then continued with quiet conviction in a system that too often overlooks young men who look like your grandson. Beatrice studied Catherine for a long moment before turning to Elijah. What do you think, baby? These are airplane people. You trust them? Elijah, who had been relatively quiet during the detailed discussions, considered the question seriously. I do, Grandma. I think they mean what they say. A small smile. And if they don't, I know you'll set them straight. This prompted another rich laugh from Beatrice. That's the truth, she turned back to the Harringtons, her expression becoming serious again. My grandson is special, not just smart, though Lord knows that brain of his has been working overtime since he was a baby, but good. The kind of good that's rare in this world. Whatever you're planning, it better be worthy of him. We know, Richard said simply. That's why we want his input from the ground up. This isn't about rich people swooping in with solutions. It's about supporting what the community actually needs. Beatrice nodded, seemingly satisfied. Well, then let's talk about this fancy doctor you're bringing in to look at my lungs next week. Elijah tells me he's some kind of specialist from your world. As the conversation shifted to Beatrice's immediate medical needs, Richard found himself observing the small apartment with new eyes. The carefully preserved furniture, the meticulously organized medical supplies, the worn textbooks stacked neatly on a small desk in the corner. Everything spoke of dignity maintained against difficult odds, of priorities centered on Elijah's future rather than immediate comforts. Later, as Elijah gave them a brief tour of the neighborhood, pointing out the understaffed community clinic with its perpetual waiting room overflow, the pharmacy that rarely stocks specialized medications, the single grocery store with its limited and overpriced produce, Richard's understanding deepened further. This wasn't abstract philanthropy anymore. It was about real people in a community that had been systematically underserved for generations. Standing on a street corner as Elijah greeted various neighbors by name, explaining the Harringtons' presence with a simple, "They're friends from a project I'm working on." Richard found himself imagining how different his own childhood might have been if born into this environment instead of his upper-middle-class, suburban upbringing. How many young people with Elijah's potential never got the chance to develop it fully? How many grandmothers like Beatrice fought daily battles against systems designed to exclude them? As they prepared to leave, Beatrice pulled Richard aside while Elijah helped Catherine down the building's treacherous stairs. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice lowered but direct as ever, "I've been watching you today, seeing how you look at things, how you listen." Richard waited, unsure where this was heading. "My grandson saved your wife because he knows things most boys his age don't," Beatrice continued. "He knows them because life made sure he had to learn them. There's been no room for innocence in his growing up." She fixed Richard with a penetrating stare. "When he helps you with this project, you make sure you're learning from him. Really learning, not just using his ideas to make yourself feel better about your privilege." The bluntness of her assessment was jarring, but Richard found himself nodding in genuine agreement. "I will, Mrs. Williams, I promise." "Good." She patted his arm, her stern expression softening slightly. "Now go take care of that wife and baby of yours, and tell Catherine I'll be expecting her back for more pie once the little one arrives." As the Bentley pulled away from the curb, Elijah standing with his grandmother on the building steps to wave goodbye, Richard reached for Catherine's hand. "What are you thinking?" she asked, noting his unusually reflective expression. "I'm thinking about how easily we might never have met them," Richard said quietly. "If you hadn't had that clot, if Elijah hadn't been on that flight, if I hadn't finally listened to him, our worlds would have continued in parallel, never intersecting." Catherine nodded, understanding the deeper implication. "And how many other Elijah are out there that we'll never meet? How many Beatrices?" The question hung between them as the car glided through Harlem streets toward the invisible border that separated this world from the wealthy Manhattan they inhabited. "What Elijah asked for," Richard said after a long silence, "it wasn't just medical care for his grandmother. It was recognition of her dignity, of his potential, of their community's worth." His voice thickened unexpectedly. "All things I would have missed completely if crisis hadn't forced me to see." Catherine squeezed his hand. "Then we make sure the initiative reflects that understanding. Not just funding, but genuine partnership. Not just for Elijah and Beatrice, but for everyone they represent." As the Bentley turned onto Fifth Avenue, the contrast between Harlem's weathered buildings and the gleaming luxury of Manhattan's Upper East Side could not have been more stark. Yet for perhaps the first time, Richard saw not just the contrast, but the connection, the shared humanity that his wealth had allowed him to forget, and that a chance encounter at 35 using FT had forced him to remember. 6 months later, as the autumn leaves turned golden across Central Park, the Harlem Community Health Initiative opened its doors in a renovated building that had once housed a shuttered community center. On the dedication plaque beneath the official language of foundation support, a simple quotation appeared. "The Lord puts knowledge where it's needed. Beatrice Williams." Inside, community residents found not just medical care, but dignity. Doctors who looked like them, staff who spoke their languages, systems designed to accommodate rather than exclude them. In one corner office decorated with medical textbooks and a framed acceptance letter to Columbia University's pre-med program, Elijah Williams spent his after-school hours coordinating between medical staff and community needs. His natural leadership abilities flourishing under mentorship that recognized his unique perspective as an asset rather than an anomaly. And in a private hospital room across town, Catherine Harrington cradled her newborn daughter, Beatrice Elizabeth Harrington, named for two strong women who had shaped the child's world before she even entered it. Beside her, Richard stood with Elijah and the elder Beatrice, who had been transported to the hospital in the Harringtons' private car to meet her namesake. "She's got good lungs," Beatrice observed as the baby's cry echoed through the room. "Strong already. Like her godfather," Catherine said, smiling up at Elijah, who looked both honored and overwhelmed by the role they had asked him to accept. As Beatrice held the newborn with practiced ease despite her oxygen tubes, cooing softly to the child who bore her name, Richard stepped back to observe the tableau. This unexpected family forged through crisis and connection, bridging worlds that should never have been separate in the first place. In that moment, watching Elijah lean close to hear something his grandmother was whispering about the baby, Richard felt the full weight of the transformation that had begun on that flight. The boy who had saved his wife and child had also offered Richard something equally precious, a chance at redemption, at becoming the man he had always claimed to be, but never truly been until now. What Elijah had asked for in return for his heroism wasn't anything Richard had expected. Not money, not connections, not personal advantage, but recognition of a shared humanity that wealth and privilege had blinded him to for too long. It was a request that had indeed brought Richard to tears, tears of shame, of gratitude, and ultimately of hope for the more connected world they were now building together, one relationship at a time. Thank you for joining us for this powerful story of connection across divides. If you've been moved by what you've heard today, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these transformative true stories to audiences worldwide.